All right, so we're going to start the next section on, and this is on evolution. So we're going to talk, this is going to be less familiar to you than the creation, I hope. So we're going to go back over and define evolution and go back over the doctrine of evolution and so forth. So this is going to be introduction to evolution. So as we continue with this class, we're going to deal exclusively almost with evolution today. So I want to go back to, of course, there's Charles Darwin, the so-called icon of evolution. I'm going to call him the father of modern evolution. Obviously, he didn't originate evolutionary ideas, but he's very influential in evolution, even today, 150 years later. So the doctrine of evolution, we are going to start with this again because I don't think evolution is an operational science at all. I think it fits better in the realm of religion. So we are going to continue to call evolution a doctrine. So here's the doctrine of evolution. We will have a little overlap in this section from the previous because we're going to learn about what evolution is, a little bit of the proponents and mechanisms of evolution. So evolution is still a doctrine. All right, it's still much more religious in nature. It's still philosophical. At best, it's historical science. But it is a big part of science today, so that's why we're going to deal with it in scientific terms. So we have the doctrine of evolution. As you remember, we had 4 tenets. Here they are again. Tenet number 1 is everything, both physical and biological, came about through natural processes. Evolution is a doctrine of naturalism. There is no supernatural. Everything is the result of natural processes. So this is the mechanism of evolution. The mechanism of evolution is natural processes or naturalism. Tenet number 2 deals with chance. Evolution is the processes of evolution are entirely random and purposeless. They're natural processes. They are not intelligently directed, so they are random. This is the mode of evolution. So the mechanism is natural processes, and as we see today, the accepted mechanism of evolution is gradualism or Darwinism. Both of those are just mechanisms to further explain which natural processes. But the mode of evolution is chance, random and purposeless processes. Tenet number 3 deals with the result of evolution. These processes resulted in higher and higher levels of order and complexity. So the result of evolution is complexity. The mechanism is naturalism. The mode is chance. The result is higher and higher levels of order and complexity. Tenet number 4, time. Evolutionary processes are extremely slow, requiring millions and millions and millions, if not billions of years. This is the requirement of evolution. So this again will be a part of this section as well, the doctrine of evolution. But let me tell you about the word evolution itself. This is the evolution of evolution. Evolution itself just means a change. It comes from Latin, the unrolling as of a scroll. If you had me in high school, you remember I told you that evolution happens in Algebra 1 all the time. Numerous people experience the evolution of the x variable into the y variable because of sloppiness. So evolution doesn't necessarily mean, the word itself in particular did not begin meaning how it's used today. Today we use it as meaning descent with modification. We use it as macroevolution, but evolution itself is simply the unfolding as of a scroll. There's Webster's 1828. And of course, it is a process of gradual change. That's what happened to those variables due to sloppy handwriting. X, the one end of the X gets longer and longer, and it evolves quite literally into the tail of a Y. And then you miss the equation because you can't tell your X's from your Y's. So evolution, the word itself, does not mean how it's used in our common vernacular. It began just meaning a gradual change. All right. And gradually, evolution itself evolved. Once we get later on in Webster's dictionary, we can see evolution is the act of unfolding, and then we're going to further define it as a process of development, formation, and growth. That is not the original meaning. It's not a process of growth necessarily. All right, so The Invitation to Biology by Sylvia Mader is a commonly used secular biology book. Here's where she's starting to define evolution in the sense that we normally think of evolution. Evolution is any change in the gene pool. And actually this would be called neo-Darwinism, because now we're starting to bring Darwinian ideas into genetics. So evolution is any change in the gene pool from one generation to the next. Darwinian evolution is the result of natural selection operation on random genetic variations. Take a look at that definition. Do you see the tenets? I see natural selection. That is a natural process, and that is a naturally observed process. We see natural selection all the time, especially in the animal kingdom. It's very noticeable. Random genetic variations. There's the mode, chance, and of course it's very gradual. And the results are going to be higher and higher level of order and complexity. Another definition from a biology textbook. Evolution is a scientific theory concerned with the development of complex things from simpler forms over a vast period of time. So if we didn't see the other tenets, we see it in this definition. So the evolution, the word itself has changed. It's evolved. It's the evolution of evolution. All right, those were just illustrations. Don't worry about those definitions. I saw some of you frantically writing. I'm illustrating how the word changed and how the use of evolution in common usage is Darwinian evolution, is gradual change from simple to complex over vast amounts of time. All right, so present understanding of evolution would be gradualism or neo-Darwinism as the mechanism. Neo, the prefix there, means new Darwinism, and basically what that is Darwinian principles have been updated to include the changes being caused by mutations in the genes. So gradualism or neo-Darwinism, and even Darwinism, very few people ever call it neo-Darwinism, but gradualism and Darwinism are synonymous, and they are basically the accepted view or mechanism of evolutionary thinking today. And the level of evolution is not micro. We're going to talk in detail more about microevolution versus macro. Macro is the type of evolution that Darwin taught. Macro is the type of evolution that they're talking about in general. When we use the word evolution, we're not talking about microevolution, which is variation within kind. We're talking about macroevolution, okay? So is evolution a theory? We've already answered this. No, I don't think it is part of operational science. So what is a theory? Theory, of course, is part of, or actually the outcome of, the scientific method. It's a hypothesis that has not been falsified by repeated experimentation and observation. So theory is the end result, or the goal even, of the scientific method. Of course, the scientific method begins with a question. You pose a question, then you might do observation and research, and from your observations and research, you're going to formulate a hypothesis. And after testing it numerous times and in numerous ways, you will then begin calling it a theory. The theory then, of course, has not been falsified. That's kind of critical in your understanding of how science works. Can we prove things absolutely in science? No. And we don't even exactly try to prove them. We try to say that, we can't say that they're 100% sure. We can't say for 100% that this is true. So what we try to do with the scientific method is see if it's not false. There's a difference between proving something true and just proving that it's not false. That's called falsification. So we have a question, we form a hypothesis to answer that question, we test it, we do more observations, we test it again, we change the variables and test it in a different way, test it again, and if it holds up to testing, then it will be elevated to the level of theory, okay? But we can't really even prove things. The goal of the scientific method is, can we show that it's not false? Can we show that it's not true? Can we show that there's nothing wrong with our thinking in this hypothesis? 3 criteria for a credible theory. What makes a theory credible? What makes it a part of operational science? What makes it subject to the scientific method? 3 criteria for a credible theory. First of all, it needs to be supported by observed events, properties, or processes. As you know, operational science takes place in the present. It needs to be supported by observed events, properties, or processes. It needs to be something that is occurring in the present. That makes it operational science when we can observe it or observe events and properties and processes related to it. Another criteria is that it's useful in predicting future phenomena. If our theory is valid, we should be able to anticipate new discovery. We should be able to anticipate new phenomena, new observations. It should be useful in predicting future phenomena. This, of course, means it's present tense. It's something that we are observing now. It is something that is useful. It's practical. It's part of the scientific method. The last is it's capable of falsification. Here's the idea, again, that we can't prove something to be absolutely true. But what we can do is show that it's probably true because we can't find a way in which it's false. That's what I mean by capable of falsification. Okay, if you listen to Ken Ham's lecture, you listen to the idea that, can we prove an animal has gone extinct for 100% sure? No, we can't. Okay, so there are limitations to science, even operational science. But the point here is that evolution is not even a theory because it's not evolutionists would say that it is supported by observed events, properties, and processes. But it's really not capable of falsification. And we're going to see that it has problems with the middle criteria. Remember, what do we think is Henry Morris's biggest contribution in the evolution-creation debate? His idea of prediction versus accommodation. That's where this argument is. I'm going to bring the argument out. Is evolution a credible theory? Does it predict future discoveries? Is it useful? Okay. Or does it have to change and accommodate itself to discoveries? For example, we find a massive fossil graveyard with hundreds of large organisms buried together. Does that fit the evolutionary scheme? Does it prove evolution? Well, actually, it has nothing to do with those animals evolving or the origin of those animals. What it has to do with is a catastrophe like the flood burying them rapidly. Another problem for evolution is the fossilized jellyfish. Okay, jellyfish do not have any bones or really any hard parts, so how in the world did a jellyfish fossilize? Rapid burial. something that's not a part of, catastrophism is not a part of the evolution model. Uniformitarianism is their answer for that. So be on the lookout, especially in this section, for prediction versus accommodation. We would argue this can be argued both ways. Evolutionists can say, yes, evolution is supported by observed events, properties, and processes. Look around you. We see all this variety. We see the beaks on the finches in the Galapagos Islands. We see how there's different kinds of beaks, and these beaks evolved one from the other. No, our answer there is they're still all finches, and there's variety in the genetic makeup of the finch that those genes code for different kinds of beaks and so forth. And so just because we observe microevolution in the world around us, does that support macroevolution? And I don't think so. So there's all kinds of arguments here. This would be very controversial for me to present this to evolutionists, because they would argue every single one of those points. They would say, yes, evolution is a credible theory. It is supported by observed events, processes, and properties. We can see evolution in action, and they're constantly pulling up, still to this day, constantly pulling up the peppered moth illustration from back in the industrial age in England. But there's a problem with that. That's still microevolution. That's variation within kind that was built into the genetic makeup of moths to be able to adapt to their environment. Adaptation to environment is not macroevolution. It is not evidence for one species evolving into another. Is it useful in predicting future phenomena? Well, I think it's weak there at best. Capable of falsification is another problem, because it's not operational science, it's more historical science. So we could have a lot of argument even with these 3 points here. I think that evolution is not a credible theory. Okay, I don't think it's even a hypothesis. Here again, I want you to understand that evolution is not operational science. Evolution is historical science at best. Evolution doesn't fit the scientific method. The scientific method involves forming a hypothesis as an answer to a question, and then testing that hypothesis in various means. So when we're working through the scientific method in operational science, we start with a question, we research, we observe, and then we formulate a hypothesis. A hypothesis is a statement taken to be true for the purpose of investigation. Evolution doesn't fit the idea of a hypothesis either. Okay? Instead, evolution could be a model, and even more general and more applicable is the idea of evolution being a paradigm. Okay? It doesn't really fit the scientific method. It's not a hypothesis. So that means it's not a theory either. So a hypothesis is part of the scientific method. It is formulated experimentally, okay? It is not something that is philosophical and decided ahead of time. Evolution is a basic assumption that scientists reason from. It's a starting point of how they look at all their evidence. That makes it more of a paradigm rather than even a model, and certainly not a theory. A model is more a part of operational science as well. Remember, what is a model? What's a model? It's a representation of what we're studying that we can't or have very difficult time observing directly. So evolution just does not fit the classical use of the scientific method. That makes it historical science rather than operational science. So evolution is not a theory. Instead, we're going to call it a paradigm. It's a basic assumption or a starting point from which scientists reason. It's a foundational assumption. It's much bigger than a model. Okay? It's a basic assumption What's your paradigm? I hope it's biblical creationism rather than evolution. But you, as a scientist, you will have basic assumptions that you reason from. You will have a worldview that affects your opinions and affects your beliefs, and even affects how you look at evidence as a scientist. So evolution is not a hypothesis, so it can never be elevated to a theory. Evolution is even more than just a model. I think evolution belongs in religion class, as where we have it here. This is a Bible class. But if we are going to discuss it in a scientific manner, we're going to call it a paradigm. Okay, a paradigm is a basic assumption from which scientists reason. It's a basic assumption that they start from and they look at evidence in light of. So evolutionary scientists look at the world around them, make their discoveries, interpret data, all on the basis of their evolutionary paradigm. Okay? So the study of origins itself is outside the realm of quantitative science. What is quantitative science? It's measurable. It's outside, it's not really subject to the scientific method. All right, scientifically speaking, we need to refer to evolution as a paradigm, a basic assumption that we start with, a basic assumption that we use to interpret data, a basic assumption that we reason from, because origins is a historical science at best. It's more like an investigation into something that happened in the past, a more historical science rather than operational science. Operational science deals with the scientific method. Operational science deals with experimentation. Operational science deals with quantitative data, and as well as qualitative. So evolution is a paradigm. It is a basic assumption or a foundational assumption from which scientists reason, and so is creation. Types of evolution. All right, when we're dealing with evolution, we could be dealing with cosmic evolution or organic evolution. Most of the time in here we are going to be dealing with organic evolution because in common usage, when you hear the term evolution, it's talking about macroevolution and it's talking about organic evolution. Cosmic evolution is an attempt to explain the origin of matter, the origin of the universe. And of course, the operating theory today is the Big Bang. And that Big Bang shouldn't really be called a theory either, but it should be called a model. But it is a theory that is accepted as the answer to the origin of matter, the origin of the universe. Organic evolution is where we're going to spend our time. Organic evolution is an attempt to explain the origin of life and its complexity. The accepted mechanism here is gradualism or Darwinism. So we'll deal very briefly with cosmic evolution and spend most of our time with organic evolution, which is, of course, the common use of the word. Trying to explain the origin of life and its complexity. How did it begin and how did it arrive at this level of complexity? Levels of evolution, as mentioned, here we have it so that you can understand it and keep it in mind. We have microevolution, which is variation within the same kind. It deals with adaptation to environment. Does this happen? Is it observable? Yes, but it is not the same thing as macroevolution. Macroevolution is the gradual change into a different kind. Gradualism is an explanation of microevolution. Well, actually, it's an explanation of both. The problem is it doesn't work for macroevolution. Macroevolution is typically what we're referring to when we say evolution. or when you're asked, do you believe in evolution? You would, of course, be mostly referring to organic evolution, the origin of life, and then at the macroevolution level. So when we deal with adaptation to environment, it's obvious. It happens all around us. It can be observed, but it doesn't explain how species originated. It doesn't explain how species developed into different species. That is the level of macroevolution. Of course, the prevailing view of evolution today is gradualism. Slow processes. That's the idea of gradualism, and that's why it was given this name. So when we're dealing with evolution, many times we'll interchange Darwinism with evolution, with gradualism. So the prevailing view or paradigm of evolution today is based on Charles Darwin's idea, particularly of natural selection. So the prevailing view of evolution is Darwinism. Of course, that's promoted by Charles Darwin, hence his name Darwinism, and his importance to evolutionary doctrine. So we're going to deal with and argue against gradualism in this section. I'm not going to really talk about the Big Bang. I'm going to talk about gradualism and problems with gradualism. So there are 3 steps of gradualism. What did Charles Darwin begin, and what has it been updated to? So gradualism includes 3 steps. The first is variation by random mutations in the genes. This, of course, would be neo-Darwinism because Charles Darwin had no idea about genetics. Charles Darwin, his main contribution is the second step, which is natural selection. He had no idea of genetics, so he just proposed this as random changes. He had no explanation for where these changes actually occurred. But when we update this to neo-Darwinism, we end up with variation by random mutations in the genes. Then the second step is natural selection. This is Darwin's contribution, natural selection. Okay, and this is what he dealt with in his book, Origin of Species. And natural selection does drive microevolution. And he tried to apply it, successfully applied it to macroevolution. So the 3 steps of gradualism, first of all, we have to have variation, and this variation comes from mutations. Then we have natural selection, also known as the survival of the fittest. So natural selection is going to promote the best gene combination, the one that is best suited to the environment. So this is literally the survival of the fittest. So we have different changes driven by mutation. Then natural selection will promote and select the best fit to survive. And then the last deals with gradualism because we have to have an accumulation of small changes over time. These small changes accumulate to produce new and more complex organisms. So basically what we're saying with gradualism is that over time, mutations accumulated, the good mutations which were selected accumulated, and we have different species, higher and higher levels of complexity. This is the basic idea of gradualism, updated to include genetics. So we have variation by random mutations in the genes. Then natural selection will promote the survival of the best genes, the so-called survival of the fittest. And then we have an accumulation of small changes. Those are the 3 steps of gradualism. An alternate mechanism. This alternate mechanism is an accommodation. This alternate mechanism is known as punctuated equilibrium. This has the idea, if you look at the words, punctuated, you have this interruption, okay? Equilibrium means a stasis, a steady state, no change, everything's balanced. So equilibrium has the ideas of a balanced state that doesn't change. So punctuated equilibrium is the idea that there are long periods of stasis, balance, no change, interrupted or punctuated by rapid periods of changes. What is this an accommodation for? What's missing that should be found in what is purported to be the best evidence for evolution? What is promoted as the best evidence for evolution? Yes?
The Galapagos finches.
Okay, that's an illustration.
Okay.
And it is used a lot, but it's not the foundational evidence. Yes? The fossil record. So what's missing in the fossil record that they had to accommodate to and even propose an alternate mechanism? What's missing? Yes?
The changes between species.
The changes, and we call those transitional forms. If we have all these small, gradual changes that progress from simple to complex, where are they? Do you know what's in the fossil record? You know what's in the fossil record? Separate and distinct individual organisms. No transitions. There's some odd organisms, but punctuated equilibrium is an accommodation to the lack of transitional forms in the fossil record. Important point. Remember, this whole section we're going to be talking about prediction versus accommodation. Prediction versus accommodation. If gradualism were true, what would it predict in the fossil record? A progression from simple to complex. And we wouldn't have massive burial sites either, would we? So instead we find separate and distinct organisms, some of which are identical to living organisms, most of which are extinct, or most of which have variations in them. So the gradualism mechanism fails to predict what's actually found in the fossil record, so we're going to accommodate to it with this alternate method. This one is not very popular. So it is an attempt to explain the lack of transitional forms in the fossil record. That is accommodation. A good theory or a good model will predict future discoveries. So Charles Darwin in 1859, there had already been many, many fossils found, but here we are, how many years later? From Origin of Species, published in 1859, we're 180 years, give or take, and we found a whole lot more fossils. Have we found transitional forms? Every once in a while we'll get something odd in the fossil record that will be promoted as a transitional form, but very rare and fairly easy to explain. Okay, this was promoted by Stephen Gould and Niles Eldredge. Of course, it wasn't initiated or made, but Stephen Gould gave it this name and also made it more scientific rather than calling it the hopeful monster theory as it started out. Okay, so this is an alternate mechanism, and it's a good example of accommodation instead of prediction. So I want to spend some time now on Charles Darwin. Who was he? Everyone knows his name. Everyone has some ideas of who he is. Kind of depends on your perspective. So what's the truth about Charles Darwin? Who was he? What did he contribute? So Charles Darwin was a British naturalist. who brought the idea of gradual biological evolution into mainstream science in the 1800s. So we're talking about the 1800s, and during the 1800s, there weren't really any scientists in the sense that we use the word scientists. In today's vernacular, a scientist is someone who has gone to college and gotten a science degree in various levels. Back in the 1800s in England, there were no science degrees to be had. If you were going to be a scientist, actually you went to medical college, which Charles Darwin did. All right, so he was not a formally trained scientist as far as by education. So we're going to use the word naturalist. This has the idea that he studied nature, and he was very good at it. He was very methodical. Okay, but he was not a formally trained scientist. He was a naturalist, and this kind of has the idea also of it being a hobby. Of course, it had to have been a hobby of the wealthy because Charles Darwin never really had a job. So Darwin's early life, he was born on February 12th, 1809. Who else was born on that exact day? Yes, you know? Abraham Lincoln, that's correct. Same birthday, same date of birth. He had a very affluent upbringing. Okay, Charles Darwin was born into a wealthy family. He never had to earn a living. His father was a very successful doctor, and his mother came from a very wealthy industrial family in England at that time. So Charles Darwin's early life was very affluent, probably why he was able to develop his interest in studying nature and able to develop hobbies as a naturalist, studying, classifying nature. He was interested in what's called natural history from the beginning. Natural history is actually a better name for studying origins, for dealing with evolution. Rather than calling it a science, it is a natural history. So Charles Darwin is more properly called a naturalist rather than a scientist. He did a lot as a young man and even throughout his life in animal husbandry, in particular with pigeons, breeding pigeons, and noticing the variations. Okay, he was very active in observing and classifying nature. He also was interested in, he collected beetles of all types and identified them and classified them and so on. So he was an accomplished naturalist. He spent a lot of time and was very good at classifying and observing things in nature. He was a very good naturalist. He was a natural historian, not a scientist. His education, as I said, back in the 1800s, there was no, you wouldn't go to college and get a science degree. If you wanted to study science, you had to study it in the realm of medicine. So in 1825, he began attending Edinburgh University in pursuit of a medical degree, probably because of his father's influence. He left Edinburgh University, and you can find numerous quotes from Charles Darwin himself, even in his biography. He felt he was wasting his time at Edinburgh. He didn't enjoy any of his studies there. He was not cut out to be a doctor. So he left Edinburgh University, did not complete his medical training. And then he, the next year, went to Christ College, which is a part of Cambridge University, and he pursued a theology degree, which would be more to his liking as a naturalist and as a natural historian. There's Christ College. And he did graduate in 1831 with a degree in theology. So he kind of changed what he did at college. He started out in preparation to be a doctor, dropped out. That was at Edinburgh. Then he entered Christ College in preparation literally for the Anglican ministry. And he did graduate with a degree in theology. Of course, Darwin is most famous for his voyage to the Galapagos Island. Of course, that was only one stop in a 5-year survey mission. He was hired as the ship's naturalist. His job was to record and collect life as he saw it on the different stops that they made on this survey trip. The British government did a lot of these survey trips. Of course, it was no luxury liner, was it? And so it was a very difficult and long 5-year voyage. It was a 5-year survey trip. They went around the southern tip of Africa and the southern tip of South America. You can see the route taken by the HMS Beagle, captained by Captain Robert Fitzroy. It was a 5-year survey trip, and it was his job. Every time they would make landfall, he would study the wildlife and the plant life in the area. Ended up going around the southern tip of Africa and the southern tip of South America, and right here are the Galapagos Islands, right off of what is now Ecuador. All right, and this is, of course, what he's the most famous for. He observed and was very good at classifying, collecting, describing. He was a good naturalist. The unique animals that he found living on those islands. In particular, you've got the finches, tortoises, lizards. And he noticed variation among, in particular, the finch population. He documented, described, sketched, even caught and took samples of 13 different finch varieties. These finches were different in particular in their size and in the shape and size of the beak. And so he mistook the variations that he saw, that he observed, which are the result of microevolution. He mistook them. There were variations within the species. He mistook them for evidence for evolution in the true sense, in the macroevolution sense. Okay, and actually, what is the source of all the variations that he observed? And what is the reason that animal populations in particular, the different characteristics are more common at some time, and then they become less common? What is the source of that? It is in the DNA of the finch. The finch has DNA that allows for different size beaks. Okay, if you look around the room here, there's quite a bit of variety in the human species in here. Hair color, eye color, height, shape of your face, bone structure, on and on we could go. What is the source of the variation in this room? Your genetic makeup. Okay, and it's no different for those finches. So Darwin mistook the variation that he saw at the microevolutionary level as evidence for macroevolution. Did he observe macroevolution? No. And of course the answer to that is, well, it takes too much time. There's the Galapagos Islands right there. Darwin's books, first and foremost, is The Origin of Species. There's its complete title, published in 1859. The Origin of Species by Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. You can see Darwin's main contribution to evolutionary thinking is he provided the mechanism which he called natural selection. You must associate Charles Darwin with natural selection. Here he documented his observations and opinions, and if you remember the previous slides, Charles Darwin went on his 5-year voyage in 1831 to 1836, and here we are, what, 30-some years later. And according to Darwin, we make the idea of gradualism synonymous with Darwinism because According to Charles Darwin himself, gradualism is numerous, successive, slight modifications. That is the essence of gradualism. That sums up the idea very well in Darwin's own words. Numerous, successive, slight modifications. What are the 3 steps of gradualism? The first is variation by mutation. There's the slight modification. Remember, Charles Darwin in the 1850s did not know about genes and genetics. And then we see numerous, successive, slight modifications. So this has the idea of gradual changes over time. Gradualism. Numerous, successive, slight modifications. Another one of his books is The Descent of Man, published in 1871. This one was not popular at all, because here's where Charles Darwin applied natural selection to human evolution, and it was not popular. British people at the time did not like a lot of the information in this book. A lot of it was very highly racist, okay, and also very much offensive to people being told that they were the descendants of various ape species. So Charles Darwin is most known for the book Origin of Species, but that was not at all. Of course, the titles of his book are interesting. Did Darwin deal with the actual origin of the finches on the Galapagos Islands? No, he dealt with variation within the finch species on the Galapagos Islands. So he didn't really deal with origins. And look where his theories lead. Preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. And he really became unpopular when he applied everything in the Origin of Species to people in the Descent of Man. Here is Adam Segwich, one of Darwin's mentors. He met him while he was at Cambridge University. And here he is dealing with the book Descent of Man. Okay. Moral taste, he mentions. And you can see some of the results of believing in evolution right here in this quote. And this man, obviously not a Christian. But we've got dealing with the moral link to evolution. What is the moral link to evolution? What are the 2 results of believing in evolution on society? That's the moral link. Without a basis in creation and accountability to the Creator, we are going to sink to lower and lower levels of depravity. Okay? It's talking about the moral link. Were it possible to break this moral link, humanity, in my mind, would suffer damage that might brutalize it. Have we seen the results of that? Kind of as predicted by Adam Segwich? Okay, I think brutality is a good way to describe our culture in several different ways. So here's the book, Origin of Species. Have any of you read it? Parts of it? I've read most of it over a gradual amount of time because it is very detailed. Darwin, of course, died on April 19th, 1882, and he is buried in Westminster Abbey, which was a very high honor in British society. Darwin's influence. Obviously, Darwin did not originate evolutionary thinking, did he? Evolutionary thinking probably began very soon after the fall. It certainly is a part of ancient philosophies. So Darwin obviously is not the father of evolution, but he could be the father of modern evolution. Of course, his main contributions, I think, are 2. The first is that he provided the foundation for modern evolutionary science. And this is because he proposed a mechanism that on the surface sounds very scientific, and on the surface occurs, but not at the level he claims it does. We can see natural selection, particularly in the animal kingdom. We can see survival of the fittest. It is a fact of life. But the problem here is that it does not explain the origin of species. So Darwin is an important figure in the study of evolution. I think what we could say about Charles Darwin is that he provided this mechanism, and he put this nice scientific cloak over evolution. He brought evolution into mainstream science. How did he do it? So what's Charles Darwin's contribution? It's this mechanism of natural selection. And so now we can discuss evolution outside of philosophical discussions, and we bring it into the realm of scientific discussions. And again, Darwinism, not only did he provide a scientific cloak for the ideas of evolution, he also caused a big shift in culture. He's very instrumental in initiating the acceptance of evolution in the science community, and then that doesn't stay in the scientific community, does it? It spreads. It's a philosophy that gives birth to other philosophies. It has a result. The first is racism. This is very controversial for me to say that Charles Darwin was a racist. It's also very controversial for me to say that racism is a result of evolution. But if you think about what evolution means, it's a logical reasoning. Evolution is a logical reasoning starting point. Okay? Racial inequality became more and more accepted and promoted. It gave racism scientific credibility. So even though evolutionists do not want to admit this, racism is the natural result of evolutionary thinking. Maybe I should say the logical rather than natural. The logical result of evolutionary thinking is racism. Is racism on the rise in our culture? Yes. And it kind of goes hand in hand with the brutality idea and the violence in our culture. Eugenics. The prefix EU, eugenics, has the idea of true genetics. So eugenics literally means true genetics. And of course, this is a perversion of the study of genetics. This is where we are going to direct human evolutionary progress by manipulating genes. And of course, in the days of Hitler, before we had genetic engineering, how did you manipulate the human gene pool? How did you do it? By exterminating so-called inferior races. Okay, now we do have genetic genetic technologies where we can manipulate genetics. This was developed by, in fact, the term eugenics was coined by a man named Francis Galton, who was a cousin of Charles Darwin. Very popular where? Where? What does it say?
Germany.
Germany. Okay. Hitler took the logical next step to directing human evolution by exterminating what he felt were inferior races. And it didn't begin with that. What did it begin with? Extermination of handicap and people deemed unfit to reproduce. Where do those ideas come from? Not from God. So, here's Stephen Gould. Biological arguments for racism may have been common before 1859, the published date of origin of species, but they increased by what? Orders of magnitude following the acceptance of evolution. If you're honest, you know that a lot of these thought processes are directly the result of evolutionary thinking. Okay, here's an interesting book, From Darwin to Hitler. Okay, of course, Darwinism itself did not produce the Holocaust. But without it, we would lose the, look at the wording there, the scientific underpinnings. It gave Hitler, and in particular the people under him, a scientific excuse for what they were doing. Okay, and of course the Nazi atrocities was not limited to just the extermination of Jews, was it? Okay, this is a quote from Charles Darwin in The Descent of Man. Interesting picture, do you think? Okay, what is he talking about? Exterminating and replacing the savage races throughout the world. And this was not in The Origin of Species, this was in the book Descent of Man. He wasn't talking about races of animal species, was he? Okay, so Darwin was a racist, whether or not evolutionists want to admit that or not, or whether or not they want to make fun of us for bringing it out or not. Modern proponents. Sir Julian Huxley, another British. Sir Julian Huxley was a proponent of evolution. He's an English biologist, was an English biologist and philosopher, a very vocal humanist. Of course, humanism and evolution go hand in hand. And he was very active in promoting evolutionary ideas in the science community and making them more and more foundational to scientific thinking. He is the grandson of Thomas Huxley, who was a contemporary and very strong promoter of Charles Darwin. Of course, he's going to usher in the era of neo-Darwinism. By this time, we're beginning the study of genetics and being able to understand what could the source of this variation be, Sir Julian Huxley. Then we have this Japanese biologist, Kimura, another more recent when you compare them to Charles Darwin. Here we have neo-Darwinism itself. He is a geneticist, was a geneticist with the National Institute of Genetics, and he introduced a theory trying to start giving evolution a genetic and molecular mechanism. So here's the influence of genetics being put into evolutionary thinking. Here's Stephen Gould, recently, well, relatively recently, 2002, passed away of cancer. He was an American paleontologist and evolutionary biologist. He, of course, developed and promoted punctuated equilibrium with Niles Eldredge. Also a very prolific author. He was trying to explain natural history, and of course he dealt with punctuated equilibrium. Richard Dawkins, actually his first name is Clinton Richard Dawkins, 1941 to the present. He's a very prominent, vocal, and even hateful atheist. He's against religion of all kinds. Of course, he is an evolutionary biologist and a very, very prolific author. He's associated with Oxford University, held a position there until 2008. As you can see, he's in his 70s. He's a very outspoken and very critical opponent of not only creationism, but religion itself, in particular Christianity. He's a very outspoken critic of Christianity and, of course, of creationism. So there's Richard Dawkins. As he's getting older, he's saying more and more bizarre things, and he's even drawing criticism from the evolutionary crowd. There's his books. I have several of those, and have read. Here's his first book, The Selfish Gene, Applying Darwinian Principles to Genetics. The Blind Watchmaker, the second book there. That is an argument against the idea if you find a watch, you know that there was a watchmaker. The God Delusion, I started reading that, stopped. It was very offensive. Okay, he's a very outspoken atheist, attacks Christianity every chance he gets. So, of course, he does attack evolution. So, I do want to remind you in conclusion today of where we are putting evolution. From the previous section, I want you to retain and remember that we're dealing with evolutionism and creationism. Why did I add the ism behind both of those ideas in this slide? Because they're both religious equally. One of the big arguments and one of the big criticisms of creationism is that it's religious, but evolution, on the other hand, is what? Science. And it's simply not the case. Both evolutionism and creationism are religious. Okay, let's compare them. Again, they are both, we're in the same boat. I'm going to admit that I believe in creationism by faith. Why won't they admit that they believe in evolution by faith as well? They are both equally what? Religious. That's why I'm calling it evolutionism and creationism. So I'm pulling this from the other section and dealing with it again in this section. Both of them faith-based. Both of them are foundational to your whole belief system, foundational to your worldview. Preached zealously. If you've ever seen Richard Dawkins, it's amazing in how he is such an atheist and such an evolutionist. He's a zealot, just as much as we should be for Christianity. Both are based on presumption that is not questioned. Remember, if we are going to pull evolution and creation into the scientific discussion, we call them paradigm. Both of them are a paradigm, a basic assumption that we don't question. Do we question creationism when we are interpreting our science data and when we're studying about in biology, when we're studying about different things? We don't. We don't question it. It's our paradigm. And evolution is exactly the same. It's based on the presupposition that evolution is true. It's based on the presupposition that God did not create. It is a paradigm. Both are very influential in scope because they are foundational. Also, they're both philosophical. So they're religious and philosophical rather than scientific. In creationism, God is sovereign and God is the basis of it. In evolution, atheism, no God, is foundational. God is eternal. Well, matter would have to be eternal. Very difficult explaining how the Big Bang occurred in the very first place. God is all-powerful, so nature, in fact, even natural selection, replaces God as all-powerful. God is the author of truth. Truth is relative. It's kind of what you think what you want it to be. The Bible is God's revelation to man. The Bible is just an old book. Maybe we can talk about it in literature class. So keep in mind that evolutionism and creationism are belief systems. They're very religious in nature. If we deal with them in science, what are we going to call them? A what? Somebody tell me. A paradigm. Not a theory, not a hypothesis, not even a model. So remember, we're looking for prediction versus accommodation. Which model is the best explanation? They're religious. They're philosophical. Can I prove them or disprove them? No. So I have to look at it a different way. Which one has the best explanations? Which one has the fewest contradictions? What is the best paradigm? Which model best predicts the discovery of new data? Okay, keep in mind what is Henry Morris's best contribution, in my opinion, to the evolution-creation debate. Prediction versus accommodation. Evolution, what does it do? It's continuously adapting itself to new data. It's accommodation. Whereas creation will forecast. In particular, the flood is very good at forecasting what we find in the fossil record. Oh, there's T-Rex. Another icon of evolution.